as part of the NFSA and the Future Leadership Committee for the NFSA, we have come up with an idea of interviewing legends and leaders of the industry. And Larry, as the current Golden Sprinkler Award winner for 2020, we've decided that you would be a prime candidate to be able to kick us off with some insights on what made you continue with the industry, drive towards where you got to today and are still pushing for the industry, and just some key information points about your success and friendships, relationships, and what would help drive people like myself and others in the industry who are on the fence of, do I continue down this path? How do I grow, and how do I become a major influencer in fire protection? So the general background and idea to this is to encourage people to do a little bit more.
I really appreciate that context, because outside of that context, being interviewed for a legends and leader thing, it sounds a bit like a self-aggrandizement opportunity. But I think doing it in a context of helping people in the industry, understand some of the things that have helped me, some of the things that others have taught me, I think is a wonderful, wonderful thing to do.
Well, you're a prime person. I mean, aside from being extremely famous in the NFSA world, you are definitely an inspiration to many of us at Victaulic, and have been for numerous years. So prime candidate for what we'd like to do here.
Sure.
So we put together a list of questions, which we have shared with you, of course. But just to start, what truly defined your success? So if you were to look back and think, what was something that made your success today truly in your mind?
I thought obviously a lot about this, and I thought the question was really excellent, because in the context of individual contributions, you can say, well, success is equivalent to goal attainment. But in a broader context of a career progression or impact on the industry, it takes on a little bit of different tone. And what I came up with is I think that one of the things that's helped me is not being concerned about staying in any one particular classification. And I'll give you an example. If you want to be successful in the fire protection industry and NFPA in particular, one of the things you have to understand is, NFSA exists primarily for contractors. And if you go into that organization and you try to operate like a vendor, you're going to fail. So by defying classification, I'm saying that I go into these sessions and I try to think, wherever I may be, like the other party, whoever's sitting at the other side of the table. And I really try to morph into them. And I've had recurring lessons and objectives throughout my career. And the earliest one I can recall is I had just begun doing a little bit of application engineering work with salespeople in Victaulic. And I did well enough that the chairman wanted to talk to me. So I go up to his office, and I'm like, 20-something years old, and I'm a little bit nervous. And he opens up, and he was a very insightful man. He opens up by saying, for an engineer, you got a great line of bullshit. And I recognize that he didn't mean that in a negative context. He actually felt that was a great combination of characteristics to have. In other words, someone who comes from, let's face it, the land of the, I'll say, nerds, right, but who enjoys and is competent at communicating with others. So throughout my career, I found that let's not get too concerned about what people perceive you are. Let's try to continue to morph into them. So I've been accused of being a salesman, a lawyer, I have to classify myself. And I've always found that, I've always taken that as a compliment.
Sure.
Because that means that you've placed yourself so deeply into the role that you may not have the formal training for, that others are perceiving you in that role. So I think existing as a citizen of the universe or a member of the industry, or however you want to define it, is a very attractive capability. And some of the characterizations that you hear from industrial trainers or business trainers are, well, they talk about silos. Right. So another way of saying this is, I think that I'm proud of the fact, and I believe it's a good lesson to share with people, that most issues occur between the silos. They occur between departments. And if you can exist comfortably between those places, you're going to make a contribution.
Very valid point. And being his part and seeing some of that over my short career, it's definitely a testament to what you've been able to do in that space. If you were to, is that a piece of advice that you would give to someone coming into this space, to think of them to be able to be coexistent or be cooperative between those spaces or silos, as a good piece of advice? Or is it still something that knowing your strengths in what you've been good to do and focusing on those strengths to succeed?
Well, I think the first thing that anyone should do who's entering the industry is keep in mind that there are some general personal characteristics that you have to inventory. So number one to me is self-awareness. If you're not self-aware, if you don't have a sense of how others perceive you, and I'm not talking about what they say they think of you, I'm talking about what they really feel inside. That's the thing you got to get past. Because particularly in this day and age, I think there's such a reluctance for people to speak critically. Even if they're trying to do it in the most comprehensive and nurturing sense, I think giving bad news to somebody is something that tends to get avoided now. So you got to do that on your own. You got to listen to what people say, but you got to act on what they actually do. And self-awareness is one of the things that's way up there on the list. I think another thing in that same category, and this is something that you can make your own judgment on, is you've got to think in terms of what value do you bring to your friends, colleagues, and other parties. I mean, it sounds a little bit cold-hearted, but if you're asked to do something, how well do you do it? And I'm not just talking about goal achievement. It's sort of like if you watch the Olympics and they talk about ice skaters have two classification systems. They have the hardcore analytic achievement part, where you get a number, but then they also have points they give for style. So in the fire sprinkler industry, I think if you bring value by solving the problem, that's wonderful. But if you do it in a manner that's in harmony with the objectives of the industry, that doesn't rustle any more feathers than you have to have, that leaves a lasting legacy of accomplishment that the association can be proud of, I think that's another thing you need to do. You need to be self-aware. I think you need to bring value. And then probably the last thing, which is very unnatural for a lot of people, is to run into the fire, no pun intended. Meaning, when there's controversy and people have to step up, and very often nobody's asking for volunteers. Nobody's going to stand up there and say, we've got this extremely ugly problem. It's going to be extremely harmful to our organization, association, or to our friends and colleagues. Would one of you please stand up? That almost never happens in my experience. you have to develop the type of sensitivity that identifies on your own when those things arise, and you need to be one of the people that steps forward. So if you run into the fire, you bring value, and you're self-aware, I think it's hard not to have a good career.
Excellent. So, speaking to some of that, who gave you your sense of character in that? So, if that is the right ideas as to what has been for your success, how did you come about with that for your sense of character?
Well, I thought a couple of people came to mind. Okay, and first of all, with my parents. You know, my father was he was a maintenance foreman by trade, and he was responsible for production lines, keeping the lines running. So he imbued in me this sense of, no matter what happens, you got to get it done. And if you don't have the right things to do it, then do it with the wrong things, but get it done. Okay. I think my mother taught me empathy for others, and I think that's something that also helped form my character. You know, I'm constantly thinking about how are other people thinking about what I say.
Sure.
And I think the last thing was, and it's just a little bit of a story, are my wrestling coaches. Okay, I was a wrestler, and I remember when I first went to school, I went to a prep school, a Catholic prep school. And my first day there, you had to fill out this inventory, and you're required to select activities. You know, activities that you're going to join outside Scholastic. So being a nerd by nature, I figured I'd pick a couple of things that made sense to me. So one I picked was the science club, which was easy. Then I picked the electronics club. And then, perhaps a surprise, I picked the glee club. So I picked 3 organizations that I thought, hey, I'm going to take this one step at a time. I'm completely new here. That's what I'm going to do.
And you didn't pursue the acting or the singing career?
I didn't pursue the acting or the singing, and I can tell you right now, I'm not gonna break into song in any part of this interview. So then the next thing that happens is, at the time, and this is back in the 60s now, okay, they were an athletic powerhouse, as a lot of those all boys schools were. So when you went to gym, the first thing they did for you in gym was you had to take a number of tests, aptitude tests. So here's this kid, and I was a strong kid. I was about 6 feet already, even as a freshman. I take this athletic aptitude test at almost 200 pounds. I do 13 chin-ups, I forget how many it is or whatever. And 3 coaches, they're standing there and they're watching, you know, they've got clipboards. And I get done, and I'm waiting for them to tell me I can leave. And they say, you're a heavyweight wrestler. Report to the coach. So I'm thinking, you know, what has just happened to me? But during the course of training for wrestling, I was forced into what to me at the time was a very uncomfortable situation. But then gradually, as I began to train, I started to realize, you know what? There's something to this.
Right.
You know, these guys caused me, as part of the education process, to place myself into a situation that to them was automatic, that I considered absolutely diametrically opposed to what I was.
You fit the bill in these categories.
I fit the bill in categories I didn't even know existed. And I had a great time, you know, in athletics, and I was involved in that for about 8 years.
Wow.
So I think my parents and some of my athletic coaches helped with that. And there's one other individual too, and I mentioned him before, who was the first chairman of Victaulic. And you know, I don't want to exclude anyone else from my Victaulic career because there were quite a few. But this guy was a brutally frank individual. I mean, you were thumbs up or thumbs down. He liked the product or he didn't. He supported an organization or he didn't. And I remember thinking, boy, how pleasant is this? If you're a performer, he had nothing but support for you.
Right.
But if you were not a performer, oh boy, I wouldn't want to be you. I wouldn't want to be you. And I often think, if you fast forward to let's say the early 2000s, this guy probably would have been arrested for that operating style. But way back when, he was sort of like those coaches. He saw an ability, he saw a product, he just instinctively had that type of drive and vision. And I think that also helped me out quite a bit. So there are a lot of people who helped.
That's fantastic. Do you have any, there will never be ethical rules? So is there certain things to you that there's the line, you'll walk up to it, you might peer over it, but you're not going to take that step?
Well, there were, these are the types of things I think that I sort of stumbled across as my career progressed. And I probably have one right now that's endured with me for the past 30 or so years. And that is never hire for pedigree. Never hire for pedigree. And I got to that because early in my career, I found that as we were trying to grow as a company, we're trying to achieve some status, particularly technically, I would get mesmerized. I was like a moth to the flame with if someone went to MIT or these various other Caltech or these engineering organizations. And I recall two...
They must be good.
Oh, yeah, they've got to be good. I mean, if you went to this school, you've got to be good. And I found out through extremely painful experiences that the only thing these guys were good at was reminding people what school they went to. And then I was faced with the unenviable task of extracting them from our workforce. And so that's one of the things that I've used as a third rail, is I never try to hire for pedigree. And during the course of an interview, I mean, you're an example of that,
Sure.
right? Not to say that, that you didn't have background, but you came from an unusual trajectory, and if I may say so, you're pretty successful in this role.
I'm trying.
But you wound up where you did because, first of all, you had the practical background. You actually knew what turning a wrench was. That's a big deal.
Yep.
I think you also had some struggles in terms of your early career. But I also think, and I remember very clearly that always thought you were a very personable, strong communicator. So when I saw, those things in combination, even though you didn't fit the classic list of objectives for someone to be working in an application engineering role, guess what? Here you are.
I appreciate that. I certainly didn't have the pedigree, I know that much.
No.
I was one of those the mutts that came through, but yeah, no, I appreciate those words, Larry, for sure. It's nice to hear that and as I've seen in career too, it's that there are people that have abilities outside of the education end that can still provide enormous values in different ways, and I think that's a very good message to the many individuals in the industry. It's not a matter of don't continue to strive for your goals and your education, but there's other ways where you can be still very influential with who you are and how you act.
And I think, as a continuing message to future leaders, I think it's only gotten more difficult now. And that's because of all of the software tools that exist to create resumes. So somebody's sitting in some ivory tower someplace, taking a look at all this data, and they're looking to make connections. They don't care if the connection's successful. They're basically being compensated by just making the connection. So they're taking people who may have put together a fairly honest, sincere resume, and they're saying, well, here's the buzzwords that no one wants to hear.
Right.
Take all of these out of your resume. And here's the things that people like to hear. Okay. So I found that, recently when you take a look at a lot of resumes, they sort of have this hollow sort of sound because these same recurring themes seem to show up over and over. And I know, the last few people I've interviewed, I would get some incredible reactions from them because I would ask them things like, have you ever changed your own spark plugs? Okay.
And these are typically engineering people.
Yeah, these are typically engineering people. Have you ever changed your own spark plugs? Have you ever installed an electrical outlet? Have you ever helped anyone build anything? And in a lot of cases, I'm left with these incredibly blank stares. But what that tells me is you may come here with an academic pedigree, but in terms of the knowledge of the real world, and remember, engineering is the practical application of science, okay? It's not, being able to solve differential equations. So that's been a recurring theme to me.
Appreciate that. Relationships. So in this industry, it's fairly tight-knit today, and has been for many years. Relationships form with a vast variety of people, and from sitting through the Manufacturers Council, knowing that outside of those four walls of whatever meeting it is, we are rivals. And we're competitive and fierce rivals with the other manufacturers. Sitting inside those four walls, and even socially, it's a different story. How are some of those relationships mattered to you over time, and have they changed or evolved, where they've gotten a little better or a little worse? But did that help you and change the way you approached the association and potentially the industry because of it?
I think that's one of the most important questions on that list, and I can tell you this, that I've long learned that you have to begin. I mentioned self-awareness before. I can't underscore that enough. Okay. But in terms of self-awareness and in terms of developing these relationships, it gets back into some of the fundamentals I mentioned before, but it comes down to, in NFSA in particular, the people you mentioned in the Manufacturers Council, as an example, and the people who are our board members, they tend to be self-made individuals. The men and women I've met in the NFSA, every one of them has struggled through some form of adversity to get where they are. And I think that all of us that are part of that recognize that all these people who have managed to get through these struggles and have wound up in this room seeking to solve and create the same success and objectives have a lot more power than people who got there because they were appointed by others and who never had to endure the struggle. And particularly for the people in NFSA who are heads of their own organizations. To strike out on your own, to start a business, put your family's economic life in jeopardy, takes a lot of nerve and a lot of courage. And people that have done that have one trait that I think is very, very powerful. They see through bullshit like a freaking laser beam.
Correct.
And they make you better. So when I walk into NFSA board meetings or any industry board meeting, you tend to get a sense of who's been through the wars, who's made it,
Yeah.
what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are. And if there's a mutual exchange of value, and a mutual respect as individuals, which there typically is, I think you form bonds and a level of effectiveness that's impossible to attain, as an example, in a boss-associate relationship.
Sure.
Heck, at Victaulic, I'd walk around the halls, you'd do your Queen Elizabeth tour, and everybody knows, oh, that's Larry, and he's got this whole background. But if you join an external organization, whether it's the PTA, the Boy or Girl Scouts, an athletic team with your kids, these people don't know you from a hole in the ground. So your achievement and recognition in those external organizations is a far better judge of where you stand in terms of making helpful contributions, and where you stand on the level of who's respected and who's not, than you typically tend to get in your workplace, where there's an order.
And at that point, you get that, I dare say you could get that feedback based on your acceptance into the association.
Sure.
So you know if you're gelling well with somebody because they've started to open up.
I mean, I think early on at the NFSA, I said, this is sort of, you're going to think this is unusual for me to say this to you, and I said this to the board. I said, I actually like you people, okay? I actually like you people. And I think that's a real turning point, because very often the relationships that suppliers have with distributors and customers, et cetera, it may not be adversarial, but everybody sort of knows where they stand. And I think the ability to cross over into the other person's territory just builds so much depth into those relationships. I mean, I can't begin to describe it.
Yeah, and again, I've seen it in real life, and it's been an honor and a privilege to see how that reaction is, and I couldn't agree more with those words. I mean, it's a very wide-opening ideal when you do sit on the other side and you don't get to mix with your competitors or realistically your peers in the industry.
And
opposing them all the time, and that's not really what happens.
I have to tell you, and this is not gloating, but I often take some amusement from watching others who enter that environment.
Correct.
Who don't have a sense of self-awareness. And I'm sitting there thinking, this poor person has 3 of their 4 engines already shot out. They have no chance of walking away from their landing. At this point, they should just close their mouth, fold their hands, and be quiet.
Commit to it.
Yeah, but they don't always do that.
Correct. Yeah, there's definitely characters in our industry, that's for certain. And it makes it the fun side of things, I think, to have those individuals, for sure.
Yeah.
Who are your heroes and why? And I picked this question separately. I think it's part of the bigger group, but just curious. I mean, you'd mentioned where your influence had come from earlier, to where your character had come from, but who were your heroes, or are your heroes?
Well, I guess if I set aside some of the people I mentioned before, who I think do bleed over into that category, and I try to put this in some type of historical context, to give the future leaders some idea of, what I think is important. There are 2 that come to mind. One is Leonardo da Vinci. Okay? I think that being a Renaissance man, it sort of ties into the what I mentioned before about defying classification. Well, what do people consider Leonardo da Vinci? Well, was he an artist? Was he an inventor? Was he a patron of worthy causes? Was he a politician? He did some work on anatomy, sculpture, painting, whatever you may think. But clearly, I think there's a lot of benefit from defying being classified in any one particular category.
Sure.
particularly as you're progressing in your career. And I think you should force yourself to be uncomfortable by placing yourself in some role that isn't necessarily something you enjoy doing or makes you uncomfortable, because it does build your character. So I think Da Vinci's one. The other one is probably Pope John Paul II, because I can recall when there were the strikes in Poland in the Gdansk shipyard. And I recall that he went to the shipyards and was standing there with the rioters, staring down the Russians, saying, my God, this guy's going to be killed. But in terms of dissenting opinion and doing it with class, and particularly in the context of our current political situation,
Sure.
I think he gets my nod for hero also.
Interesting choices, and
Yep.
that's the big insight, Larry. I appreciate it. If the one here, I think, is looking at how you've gone through life and how your career has progressed. How did you balance it? How did you manage the work-life aspect of it? And I of course, I know Margaret, and
Right.
Fabulous person, and I'm sure a very fantastic wife and mother to you. But how did that work-life balance work for you?
Well, in all honesty, early on, it took quite a bit of getting used to, because between the two of us, you'd miss whether PTA or a play occasionally, and at the time, when I was doing, it wasn't even application engineering, it was troubleshooting for Victaulic. I mean, it was get a call, jump on a plane, dive into the fire. It wasn't as though I could go home and say, well, dear, in 2 weeks, I'm going to be in Seattle. No, it was calling from the car saying, I'm on the way to the airport, I'm going to Minneapolis. Okay, so market played a big role in that balance. And I think that's another commonality you're going to see behind all of the individuals you mentioned before in the association. Mm-hmm. I think they all have a supportive spouse. Right. And I think that does play a big role. But for me personally, aside from having her supporting me, I think I also had to be prepared to understand that achieving that balance meant I was not going to be at every athletic event. Yeah. I was a scout leader for 10 years, okay? And I was the scoutmaster. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't there for every activity, but I did develop an organization there. And it's sort of like your home life. As our sons became older, they took on some of the roles. So initially, it was very, very challenging when our kids were small. Yeah. But as I became used to the career, Margaret became used to the career, our sons were able to pick up some of the tasks at home and things like that, things became a lot easier. And now I have to say, for a lot of the NFSA events, that I've been, where I've been able to take Margaret along, she looks forward to these things.
Of course.
And I think right now, the COVID has clearly shut down that opportunity, and I think she misses seeing people on a personal level. Yeah. So the balance is a tough thing.
It is, and I know that from working in the company, it's not always a 9 to 5. It's not as though you can put in your 9 to 5 in any of the roles that we've been part of or adjacent to and think that that's going to satisfy. So it always has been that little bit more. Your mention of COVID is on point. I think that it's become probably as hard in that there doesn't seem to be a defining line between work hours anymore. When you're virtually creating or having your workday flow, that virtual time becomes a blur, and a bathroom break or a lunch break seems almost like you have to reserve your time for. So I think that's something that definitely needs to be concentrated for to help encourage a better work life with some of the current situation and workings.
But I think also, you know, in the if you view this from my perspective, and I think I started with Victaulic in 1973. In 1973, for a lot of key roles, you wouldn't think of hiring a woman because she was going to get pregnant. Okay, so look at how far we've progressed with respect to raising families, caring for elder relatives, continuing education, accommodating outside activities. To me, it's been a very good thing, but it also means that getting back to those traits and characteristics we were talking about, self-discipline, I think, has risen up to a much, much higher level, because people are no longer working in a highly constructed, structured organization where their days are frozen. You now have the ability to decide how long you want to prepare for something, what you want to do, where you want to conduct the meetings. And I know for myself, I mean, I've got a lot of these Teams meetings and things that occur with Victaulic people, with industry people, et cetera. And I've got the whole wardrobe. I've got my little studio set up there with the, make sure I can take my t-shirt off and put another shirt on before I get in front of the video camera. But,
the old news presenter where they're wearing shorts underneath and a suit and tie on top.
Well, not quite, but you know, you think about things like that.
Yeah.
You think about things like that, and once again, you think about, are you being helpful? Are you providing value to the other people on the call? Are you making the most efficient use of their time? So I think it's got a lot to do with, even right now, am I giving you value? I mean, I can't help but think that way.
Sure.
I can't help thinking past you to the target audience. You know, if it's the future leaders. And I would say, I'd encourage them, you know, anyone who sees portions of this, if you want to ask me a question, ask me a question.
No, that's great. I mean, I think the comment about self-discipline is a big factor. You know, I think that's, for me, I take that one to heart. I probably lack a little bit of that self-discipline in a few areas, given that I don't always know when to say no.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that a lot of people blur those lines with, and creating that work-life balance by having some self-discipline to say, I have a family event, can we do it at another time? Having flexibility.
And I think, you know, you can apply this to enterprises, to our businesses. What type of culture, aside from the family culture, what type of employee culture do they have? Or do they legitimately care about the outcomes of the lives of their employees? How visible is this? Okay. And I say this, and I've got such an advantage over most of the people who are going to see this, because I came from the environment, grew up in the environment where that was not the case. Okay, so I know what the other system was like. So to me, what we have right now is far more valuable, I think, than most people realize.
No, that's a fantastic point, for sure. If you were to leave something for someone to think or take with them, what do you think would be, or what do you think would surprise somebody if they were to achieve similar levels of success to you? So if they were to look at today to see how you've gotten there, what do you now know that to get to that level of success that might have made your road or your journey a little easier, or avoided a pitfall here or there?
And once again, I have to tell you, when I got notice of this interview and these questions, it made me think about things. But one of the things my response to that would be, your education in everything never ever stops. And through the course of a day, I find myself Googling words, scientific phenomena, corrosion rates, ASME codes, NFPA standards every day. And once again, if you came up through the, let's say the late 60s and early 70s, where we used to have to go to libraries and make a trip to the library, stay in these little cubicles, okay, go to photocopy machines. I mean, what we have now is incredible. So I think that last message would be, your education in every subject never stops. And if you allow it to stop, you are shooting out your own 3 engines on your own.
Sure, sure. Based on that last comment of researching words, you're a famous wordsmith. Everyone's known you very well for your use of vocabulary. Any last pointers for what has got you to that state?
Well, I don't have a particular phrase, but I got to admit, when I am working with Victaulic people, they're bringing these things up all the time, and you know, I remember having said them, and they're valid. I'm trying to think of a couple right now, but I can't. But I think it goes to the fact that when I'm communicating with people, I am trying to get to them. I'm trying to say things in terms that they can understand, and that's going to stick with them. And you know, I can remark once that I was actually in one of our chairman's staff meetings, and as you know, I'm also an auto enthusiast. I raced automobiles earlier in my life, and 2 parts of the story. One is, I went with my sons and we decided we were going to go see Talladega Nights, okay, which was the Will Ferrell movie all about NASCAR racing. And you know, it's considered by a lot of people, this is a lowbrow movie. You know, I don't know that I want to be seen there. Okay. So I go into the local theater, I sit down, and I look up ahead, and in 2 or 3 rows ahead of me is another one of Victaulic's executive staff members. And I called his name out, and I remember him not wanting to turn around because of the horror of being seen in this movie.
Right.
Okay. But then I recall...
It's a good movie, though.
What's that?
It is a good movie.
It is a good movie. I'll admit it, I enjoyed it. So in one of the staff meetings, and I can't recall whether it was me or you know, my friend and colleague Gary Moore was also an active automobile racer. One of us said, if you're not first, you're last. And we got a reaction from half the people in that room, all of which I guess want to perceive that they're going to Broadway or the Lincoln Center for their entertainment. So it reinforced the value of using different phrases, different colorful phrases, as a way to really speak to the heart of your audience. So I think it's interesting people recognize that, because it's not something that I particularly always took note of.
You've done a good job of it, Larry, that's for certain.
Do you have any that come to mind?
I don't right now. I was trying to write that down and scribble some of those down this morning, and I just didn't have any that were coming to...
Well, I did think of one.
Oh.
And this is one that works with, mostly with engineers and engineering discussions. You know, we're debating some apparently insurmountable problem, and we're involved in these deep discussions about how we can use science to overcome something that appears to be not capable of being overcome. And that phrase is, you know, people you can't fight Isaac Newton, gravity, or sunshine. And that's something I think that I've heard people use over and over again to indicate situations where no matter how much you may want it, Mother Nature can be a cruel mistress.
Sure.
So.
No, look, I greatly appreciate the interview and the time today, Larry.
You're very welcome.
I think this is a great testament to what you've been able to do for Victaulic, but what you've also done for the NFSA. And congratulations again on the Golden Sprinkler Award this year. It's very deserved, and thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, Daniel. I enjoyed it.